So welcome to anyone who is watching these webinars in two different parts that have been taped previously. This is the webinar on federal education policy and funding, where we're going to dive pretty in depth into some of the key issues that we're advocating for, a little bit more so than we are going to have time to do during our training session when you all are here in DC. So glad that you're all here for this webinar. And again, for those of you who are watching the recorded webinar, I will go ahead and do introductions once again. This is Amanda Carhughes. I'm the Director of Advocacy here at NASSP, and I will let my colleagues in the room all introduce themselves.
Yeah, I'm Zach Scott. I'm the Senior Manager of Federal Engagement and Outreach at NASSP.
Hey, I'm Greg Waples. I'm the Senior Manager of State Engagement and Outreach at NASSP.
And I'm Danny Carlson, Assistant Executive Director for Policy and Advocacy at NAESP.
Great, so just to give a brief overview of sort of the federal landscape, we all know that our president and the current Secretary of Education have been in office for a little over a year now. We've seen sort of what their priority issues are. First, and one of the kind of first successes for the new administration was that they did pass legislation overhauling the nation's tax code that passed right before Christmas in December. They also are tackling a number of big issues, one of which is immigration. That's an issue that NASSP, I know, has taken some positions on DACA and supporting some bills to assist the Dreamers, many of whom are in our nation's high schools right now. We also have heard the president talk a lot about infrastructure being sort of his next priority issue area. That was very clear in his budget that he introduced just a few weeks ago. And then another issue that I think we'd be remiss if we didn't talk about is the unfortunate another school shooting that occurred in Florida last week. And this one, I think, is getting a lot more media attention, I think, just because of the number of students who are being so vocal right now, urging Congress and the administration to do something to prevent this from happening again. So I will remind all of you who may not know that both NAESP and NASSP came out very much opposed to proposals that are under consideration that would arm teachers or principals. That was a statement we issued shortly after the Newtown incident back in 2012. And right now, both organizations are engaging with a number of different advocacy groups that are talking about both school safety, mental health, and some of the gun violence prevention issues. I think a lot of those conversations are going to occur over the next few weeks, and we'll probably have some more talking points to share and some ideas for what you may want to discuss with your members of Congress when you're here in March. We'll talk more about that when you arrive in DC. And then on just some of the education issues that are still being talked about, certainly ESSA implementation. If you are not clear where your state's ESSA plan is in the approval process, I would certainly encourage you to take a look at that, to go to the department's website and have some understanding of how your plan and what you like and don't like in it. Budget issues, we're going to talk about much more in depth towards the end of this webinar. And then Higher Education Act reauthorization is another big issue that we'll be talking about today.
Great, just to go in a little further in depth what Amanda was just talking about in terms of what we'll be discussing in terms of policy issues today. First, for the federal education policy, we'll be talking about ESSA implementation a little bit with more of a focus on the Higher Education Act, what's ongoing there, and what we can do, what we will want you to actually advocate on while you're here, career and technical education, school choice, and then, as Amanda was just referencing, budget appropriations will be kind of our main focus in the end, with a more specific focus on Title II funding. So it's Title II of ESSA, which is actually used for teacher and principal professional development. So we will talk about that in a little bit, but I'll pass it off to Danny here, and he can get us started with the Higher Education Act.
Great, thanks, Zach. So the Higher Education Act is the federal law that governs student aid programs, as well as preparation programs for teachers and principals. So it is something of certainly of interest to our groups. And so Congress, now that ESSA is done, is moving towards this. The House Education and the Workforce Committee passed their version of the Higher Education Reauthorization Act called the Prosper Act. I'll mention in a second about some concerns that we have with that bill. And the Senate just recently, Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray just put out requests for proposals and feedback on what the Senate should do in their version of the Higher Education Act. And so back to the House bill that was passed in December. This is called the Prosper Act. It passed on a party line vote. Only Republicans voted for it. It does various things. One big thing is that it shifts the federal student loan program to a one grant, one loan system. This is in the name of streamlining programs, but it does, there's a lot of implications for students and their ability to borrow. And one of the big pieces in that is the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program, which of course school leaders are eligible for. It eliminates that, so that's a big concern. And then other things, just the income-based repayment that some teachers and principals rely on. It makes significant changes to that program, which we have a lot of concerns on. And so we are in the process of both kind of watching what the House does. There is some talk that they are going to try to move the House bill to the House floor, where the whole House would consider the bill in the coming weeks. But there's no guarantee on that. We're just kind of waiting. And then in the Senate, we have weighed in, NASSP and NAESP weighed in with some provisions that we would like to see in a Higher Education Reauthorization Act. Things like principal residencies and provisions that support the recruitment and preparation of principals. So your talking points that you'll have when you go up for your Hill visits will include everything that you need to know about what we're pushing for with the Higher Education Reauthorization Act. I think Amanda is
Yeah,
here.
and just to highlight a few of those, the first one, and one that we had talked about last year as well, is the Recruiting and Retaining Effective School Leaders Act. We do not yet have a bill number, but we're hopeful that Congresswoman Susan Davis will be reintroducing the bill before you all arrive in March. But this is a bill that would provide loan forgiveness to principals and assistant principals that work in high-need schools. And it's modeled after a similar program that is currently in place for teachers. But we definitely had heard from school leaders over the years that we're not eligible for the teacher loan forgiveness program and had difficulty or were unaware about the public service loan forgiveness program. So wanted to create something specific for principals. So while we hope that Congresswoman Davis introduces the bill, we do want you all to talk about it during your Hill meetings. Just talk about your own personal story about becoming a school principal. What kind of program did you go through? What degrees did you achieve during that process? And how much it cost you, and whether you still are paying back some of those loans today. I know I've heard from principals that this is a significant problem for some of them. I think, too, we're very hopeful that maybe we can get this attached to a substitute amendment that the House Education Committee Democrats plan to introduce on the House floor. So even if we could just talk about expanding that teacher loan forgiveness program to include eligibility for principals, I think that's a great talking point for you all when you are on the Hill in March. Another bill that we are talking about is the Educator Preparation Reform Act. It has been introduced by Senator Jack Reed from Rhode Island and Rep. Ruben Keelan from Nevada. And actually, many of the provisions in this bill are being considered by the House Education Committee Democrats in the substitute bill they're planning to offer. But it would improve accountability for teacher and principal preparation programs, includes some different kinds of reporting requirements on program features that are related to future success in the classroom, such as the admission standards, clinical prep requirements, and just the performance of some of those teachers. It would also expand the teacher quality partnership grants within Title II of HEA to include residency programs for principals. So that was a really big issue for us. And the third bill, this is probably more relevant for the high school principals who will be attending the conference, but we are encouraging you to ask your member of Congress to co-sponsor the Making Education Affordable and Accessible Act. And you can see who some of the supporters of that legislation are. But essentially, this bill would allow institutions of higher education to use their Title VII funding under HEA for dual and concurrent enrollment programs for high school students. The funding could be used to cover tuition, any other fees related to those programs, books and other materials. And then there's a requirement within the bill that funding must be used to provide teachers, principals, and other school leaders with professional development activities that help them to provide post-secondary coursework through dual or concurrent enrollment programs. So very important topic, I know, for many of our high school members.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. Next, I'm going to start talking about career and technical education, which I'm sure nobody's surprised about because I was talking about it a lot in the last, a little bit in the last webinar as well. So I'm obviously going to refer to this as CTE, as everybody knows, and the shorthand a little bit. But just to give everybody a little bit of background on CTE and where we kind of stand right now. So since 2013, Congress has been working on reauthorizing the Carl D. Perkins Career and Technical Education Act. It actually has not been reauthorized since 2006. So we're looking at over a decade since this bill has been reauthorized. I think we can all agree that CTE has evolved greatly. It's evolving greatly every couple of years, let alone in over a decade. So we are definitely needing to see some movement on this bill and on CTE programs. The House and Senate committees both passed a bipartisan bill in 2017, but the bill has not yet been marked up in the Senate, and the Senate actually hasn't even introduced a substitute yet. The bill in the House was so unanimous, actually, in the 114th Congress and the 115th Congress. I think there was only a single-digit opposition to it. So it's really frustrating to see the House be able to get this passed, but then have to sit and wait on the Senate, where they're right now a little concerned about the Secretary of Education's authority in that bill. So it's kind of difficult to see that sitting there right now, but hopefully maybe one of you will be the spark that ignites the fire on the Senate side when you guys go there and ask them to take the bill up. So that's really what we're hoping for, is to see this bill see some movement. So we do expect that the House bill will be the starting point for the Senate bill. We're just not sure what the timing of that is going to look like. And like I said, in the 114th Congress, the House passed the exact same thing, and the Senate ran out of time once again, so the House had to start all over in the 115th. They got it done again, and now we're worried time might run out again in the Senate. So fingers crossed we can get this done in the 115th before next year, basically. Really quick on CTE policy. So NASSP actually had formed an informal working group of NASSP members in the past to draft recommendations on Perkins reauthorization that were first submitted in 2013. Then we revised these in October 2015. And while this was done by NASSP, this is obviously meant for all school leaders. We want to see the CTE recommendations actually would work not just for NASSP members, but for any ESP members as well. And I think for everybody that's involved, even though CTE is obviously more focused to the middle and secondary level grades. But some of the things that were emphasized were professional development for CTE teachers, personalization, CTE in the middle grade, specific funds that can be used for training programs that help principals and teachers in those middle grades and help students adjust from those middle grades and as they go on to those higher grades as well. And professional development and accountability and data collection related to this, and just greater funding for CTE overall. CTE education is not always cheap, and to have the best things that you need to really work with and to be as effective as you need to be, there does need to be greater funding in that aspect to keep moving forward with that. One of the specific bills we're going to ask you all to talk about is actually the Middle Step Act. So NASSP and NAESP both feel very strongly that the middle grades are a crucial time to engage students in curriculums that are rigorous, but will also help them transition into high school. And that successful transition will also help them when they're ready to transition from high school into post-secondary education and careers. So the Middle Step Act would actually authorize the establishment of a pilot grant program to develop middle school CTE exploration programs. Districts should actually use these grants for apprenticeships or other work-based learning activities, individualized graduation and career plans, and plans for students to transition to high school CTE programs of study, as I kind of mentioned before. So the idea here is that by allowing for that transition from those middle levels to CTE programs based on a higher level, we're easing their way in there and making them more successful in the future. And that's really our basis there for CTE programs. We will have a little more to share with everybody once we get actually to the conference. I do want to make one quick side note. We are throwing a lot of bill numbers and bill names and things like that at everybody right now. Don't worry about memorizing these things completely. I know the bill numbers are difficult to remember and things like that. We will, as we said before, be giving everybody handouts that will have these numbers and the names of the bills on them. So you don't need to remember these things word for word. I don't want everybody sitting there trying to write so fast right now that you're missing some good information. So don't worry, we will provide you with more information at a later date so you can study this a little closer. And now I'll give it back to Amanda to talk about school vouchers.
Danny, actually.
Oh, Danny, I apologize.
I'm gonna step in. I get the fun one. No. So school choice. So the first one we're gonna talk about here is school vouchers. So obviously there's been a lot of discussion about vouchers and tax credit programs and the diverting of funds for public schools and into these various programs. NASSP and NAESP obviously have longstanding positions in opposition to school voucher or tax credit programs that would transfer public funding to private schools. Both organizations were both members of the National Coalition for Public Education. But this is again something that has under this administration there's been certainly more talk of it, more attention paid to it. So it's important to quite frankly play defense on this and make sure that folks on the Hill understand why these programs don't work in a lot of cases and why there's a lot of concern about diverting public funds to private schools. So during the election, President Trump famously proposed a $20 billion school choice program. That hasn't gone anywhere really. That was a very, very, very high number. But that's not to say that they haven't been trying to move on some of these things. The president's budget, which he released last week, included $1 billion for voucher programs. There was a significant increase in the CSP, the charter school program. And so this is just kind of the environment. This is what is out there. I'm going to go through in the next few slides a couple of those specific bills, but just know that this is something that the administration and that the secretary have been very vocal about, and it's something that we have to be watching. So a couple of those pieces, as Zach said, no worries about memorizing these bill titles and bill numbers, but just for your awareness, one of the big kind of voucher bills out there is this Choice Act, which was introduced in the Senate by Senator Tim Scott from South Carolina and Representative Todd Rokita from Indiana. The upshot of kind of what it does is that it would basically turn IDEA, which is already, of course, woefully underfunded, into a voucher program and would shift these funds to private institutions. So obviously a lot of concerns about that. The bill also would reduce impact aid, which is of course a very important program for military families and folks in Indian country as well. And so it would do those two things, which are a big concern. And then additional bills that we would urge you to oppose. The first one is the Enhancing Educational Opportunities for All Students Act. the Choices in Education Act, and the Educational Opportunities Act. Those are all, they each do different things, but the first one would really, it gets to this kind of portability issue, which we saw emerge in ESSA, which is a big concern, which again is the shifting of funds away from where they ought to be going. The second one is actually the HR 610, the Choices in Education Act, is a pretty far out there bill. It actually repeals the Elementary and Secondary School Education Act, which of course is the framework for how we have ESSA and other important programs like Title I. And then the third one is a tax credit focused bill, which allows tax credits for individual taxpayers for their contributions to go to private schools.
Great, and now I'm going to talk about everybody's favorite thing to talk about, the federal budget and appropriations, which is just a complete and absolute mess right now. So I'll try to explain it as simply as possible moving forward. Before I get started with the actual budget numbers and everything like that, I do want to go over some key terms really quickly, and that is the authorization, and appropriations. So I'm going to actually read these word for word because it is important. An authorization creates a specific program through a federal law. And an authorization bill acts as a prerequisite for an appropriation or other kinds of budget authority. So essentially an authorization is how much money can you spend on something. An authorized level of something could be, for Title II, for example, it's $2.295 billion. That was the amount ESSA they thought they needed to be effective and have this program be useful and to actually have a good impact and things like that. But then we get to the problem of appropriations. Appropriations provide the actual amount of federal dollars to a specific program. Congress actually needs to pass appropriations bills each year for the operations and programs run by the federal government. So each year, well, as everybody knows, we had a shutdown earlier this year. Reason being, they couldn't agree on they couldn't appropriate dollars for the federal government to stay open, so it actually shut down for 3 days. Appropriations actually decides the funding for each program. So although we have an authorized number, which is almost always higher in terms of education, the appropriated number is actually what is most important for us to focus on. So, for example, $2.295 billion was what Title II was authorized under ESSA. In FY 2017, it received $2.1 billion. So it essentially took about a $294 million cut from where it should have been. So that's why when you are on the Hill, we're really going to want you to advocate for the authorized number, because that was actually put into place as what was supposed to be the number that would make that program effective, as I said before. So just to make everybody really confused, we made those words 2A words and really kind of similar to each other. So first, I'm going to talk about FY 2018. So the government is still not done with fiscal year 2018, which is really unfortunate. They should have been done. Actually, they should have been done. They should have been done by October. So Congress actually has to, as all of you I'm sure know, has the power of the purse, and they must pass 12 spending bills or appropriations bills by September 30th. They actually haven't passed all 12 bills since 1994. So the chance it's going to happen anytime soon, when we're more partisan now than ever, is highly unlikely. Congress was unable to reach a short-term funding bill by September 30th, basically October 1. So they did what they've been doing the last couple of years. They actually did a short-term extension into December. Typically what happens is they do a short-term extension into September. Members really want to go home for Christmas. They kind of hold Christmas hostage, and then members will agree to a longer-term spending deal, usually about a year long. However, they were unable to come up with a year-long spending bill because of that, so they passed a shorter-term bill that carried it to February 8th. This is after the shutdown, when they had one that would carry it into late January. I'm sure everyone knows there was about a 3-day shutdown. We don't need to worry about that anymore. Hopefully we don't. Our conference is before when the next potential shutdown could happen, so we don't need to worry about that. But on February 8th, Congress once again came together and was unable to pass a longer-term spending bill. However, they did pass a deal that would raise spending caps. So basically, there's a level that is capped on how much the federal government can spend, but that number was quickly running out based due to the sequester and some other factors. So they raised those caps. Now, because the caps have been raised, the chance of them actually passing an FY18 spending bill by March 23rd, which is the next deadline, is much more likely, because now many of the programs that were either cut or eliminated originally will now receive some funding to stay around. So it'll be much easier for some members to kind of come to the bargaining table rather than take their ball and go home this time. So we're really thinking that around that March 23rd time, basically when we're having our conference, is when we may see finally a full long-term FY 2018 budget. But I do want to reiterate here, the FY 2018 budget process is still not complete, and there's a good chance, because Congress doesn't like to do, Congress is the greatest procrastinator in the world. They don't want to get anything done early, so there's a good chance that it might not, an FY 18 budget might not be completed by your Hill Day on the 21st. So something to keep in mind. We'll talk more about this as the process develops. This is kind of up in the air right now. We'll be sure to have you all trained on exactly what the budget numbers you're going to need to talk about are and what the processes are, but we're still unsure what's going to happen here. If I had a crystal ball, I could tell the future on federal budget processes, I'd be making trillions of dollars and working for a lobbying firm somewhere. So we're still trying to figure that out, but we're working on it right now to make sure everybody's comfortable with that. But we still have to think about F9 2019 appropriations. So the FY 2019 deal that actually increased budget cap spending for FY 2018 did so as well for FY 2019. It increased spending caps $69 billion, which basically means, once again, more money to go around to all these programs. President Trump actually just released his FY 2019 budget, and this included $65 billion in cuts and non-defense discretionary spending. Basically, even though he had more money to spend on non-defense programs, he still went with an extremely large cut to these programs, which is extremely worrisome for us. This included, for President Trump, a $3.6 billion cut, which would be 5.4% for the Department of Education. And this would eliminate some really important programs, most notably Title II. As I mentioned before, it would eliminate Title IV and some of our other key programs. Once again, though, while we're talking about the president's budget, president budgets really don't mean anything. They're just a way for the president to kind of point out some of his priorities moving forward. But if these are his priorities moving forward, this should still be very scary to all of us here working in education. This is not a good sign whatsoever. So we really do need to be somewhat on the offensive here when we're on Capitol Hill and trying to defend these important dollars really for education and what's going to happen moving forward. So while we're talking about FY 2018, we're still going to talk about FY 2019, because immediately once 18 is done, the appropriations process for 19 will start. I have no idea what that's going to look like. It's an election year, so typically bills move even slower, but they're often a little less controversial because people don't want to have to take tough votes. But as I said before, we're going to come back a little closer, the policy folks here, Greg, Amanda, and Danny, and I, and we'll figure out exactly what our game plan is going to be with all of you. And we will make sure all of you are well prepared. I don't want anybody to be worried about that. You will be well trained and you will be well prepared, and you'll do just a wonderful job in the Hill. We're excited for that. So some of our talking points on appropriations, Danny, I'll let you cover those.
Yeah, great. So Zach did a good job of talking about appropriations. None of these are big surprises. Obviously, Title I, the importance of Title I, we talked about how because of some of the proposals around vouchers and some other things, these programs are under attack. So again, just an opportunity to remind these congressional offices why Title I matters. And again, opportunities to show, here's what these dollars mean, and here's how we use them. Title II, which you're all very familiar with over the past few years, the House zeroed out this program. The president and the president's budget, FY 2018, and now just last week in FY 2019, zeroed out the program again. So Title II, I think that there's a lot I think that can be said about this, but I think stressing to these offices that states are in the midst of implementing ESSA, and Congress gave states and districts the ability and the opportunity to implement ESSA. States and districts are now relying on Title II funds and they are operating as though those funds are going to be there to be able to do the work that you, Congress, enabled them to do. And so pulling out the rug under them from this program is extremely short-sighted. 24 of the 50 states are using the 3% set aside for Title II. So there's a huge, states are eating this up and really need these funds. That's Title II. School Leader Recruitment and Support Program. This was a new authorization in ESSA, and obviously is important for states and districts to improve the recruitment and support and development of school leaders. The other ones there, Literacy Education for All, Results for the Nation, Learn, and then Title IV, which is some of the things that you all experience every day around things like well-rounded students, music education, STEM, access to these enrichment activities that we know are also important. These are being, this program is being underfunded and not enough attention is being given to it. So opportunity there, again, to share why it's important.
And just a couple last priorities we'll have you guys talk about when you're on the Hill. Here are IDEA state grants to IDEA grants to states. As Danny had mentioned before, IDEA is severely underfunded, so we'll be talking about that and how important it is that states get these dollars to help individuals with disabilities. And last, CTE grants to states. Once again, as I had mentioned before, this should be a program that seems to be an easy home run for everybody. Even President Trump had said that he likes the idea of CTE, but then for whatever reason, the FY 2018 budget, he cut it. So we're not really sure, but we still need to be on the offensive here, even though we think that everybody's on the same page as this. Doesn't always ring true when it comes to the appropriations process. Appropriations is a convoluted, mysterious, and kind of murky process to wade through. So hopefully we'll be able to well, these are, like I said before, the main priorities. These ones are the ones Danny covered that we're really going to ask all of you to talk about on Capitol Hill. Now, that doesn't mean you need to go through each and every one with each office. Once again, find a couple priorities that you think that you're going to be best at and maybe focus on those ones. But we do have a couple main priorities like Title II, like school leader recruitment support, that we'll have a heavier focus on moving forward. So we'll be able to share that with you guys at the conference.
Great. So that ends our presentation for the afternoon. I know that we've had a number of questions come in, so Zach is going to get closer to the screen so that we can hear what those are.
Okay, there are other high-stakes issues scheduled to be discussed in Congress the week of March 20th. Immigration, healthcare. We now know of gun control March scheduled later in the week. We are there. School safety and gun control was just addressed yesterday by the president, including his proposal that school personnel carry guns. How do you suggest we make the education-related discussions rise to the top in light of these issues that have gained so much national attention? That is an outstanding question, and one that is really difficult for organizations and lobbyists like us. We are going to talk about some issues. As Amanda mentioned before, the firearms issue is one that we are going to talk about, kind of circle back and have our groups discuss moving forward here. So that is what we will talk about. In terms of some of the other ones on there, immigration, I think was one that was specifically mentioned. A lot of those things still tie into education. If you're thinking about immigration and you have students in your school who are DACA recipients, maybe you want to talk about the importance of a student feeling comfortable at school so they can get their best education. So that's kind of the idea of the safe and healthy schools, and we kind of go back to Title IV with that. And there's other ways we can kind of workshop those things too. So all it really is going to take is some kind of creative thinking and some creative problem solving to say these issues are tied somewhat. They may not be tied completely. And it just so happens sometimes in DC, it's an ever evolving, it's a 24-hour news cycle in DC. We don't know what's going to be big today or what's going to be big tomorrow. Maybe education will come up at that point, but these issues are issues that never go away, and I think that's what's always important for us to keep stressing that. While they might not be at the top of everyone's mind, how we benefit students and influence student growth can cure so many of the difficulties that we're already seeing in a nation as a whole. So I think that's something we can talk about a little further, but that really is a wonderful question.
Yeah, and I just would add that it's always a challenge with the news cycle to try and get your issue into the conversation. But if we're not doing it, as all of you principals and NASSP and NAESP, nobody else is going to be talking about this. So It's really important for us to raise these issues to make sure that members of Congress know that we care about them and they're important to schools and their communities, because if we're not talking about them, they may never hear about them.
The next question, I am assuming that the recent school events and school safety will come up in many meetings. Will we be given talking points on this in addition to the topics you've already listed? Do we have a recent position on that? NASSP actually does have a position statement we have posted, and it was actually posted, I believe it's just referred to as school safety.
The position statement?
Yes. Okay, so we do have a position on that. I know ESP has taken some positions in the past, and I don't know if you want to share anything that you guys have done specifically, but I think, as we mentioned before here, what we're going to do is Amanda, Danny, Greg, and I are going to kind of, we've started a huddle already. We're talking about school safety. We realize that this is obviously going to be on the minds of many legislators. We are coming up with solutions for all of you right now. Unfortunately, we just didn't really have the time with this quick turnaround to really address it yet. We're working on it though, and we will have more information to follow with this.
Yeah, just to kind of add to that, we are working with a number of other organizations, some of the gun safety advocacy groups, but also some of the other major education organizations like the National PTA and others. It looks like both organizations will likely be supporting a National Day of Action that's going to take place on April 20th. And then, you know, as we mentioned, we're certainly going to oppose any proposals related to arming school employees, with the exception of school resource officers who are trained police officers who have a specialized training also to work in a school. That's really important in the National School Resource Officer Association. I can't recall their exact name. They firmly believe that as well, that it shouldn't just be armed guards at schools, but very specialized training that people receive to be working in schools and at the appropriate age level as well. And we'll probably have better clarity about what bills might be introduced before you all are here that we can talk about as well. But I think we want to talk more about a comprehensive approach. It's not going to just be about gun violence prevention, but we are talking about mental health. I would say one thing you can talk about to bring back the education issue is that Title IV block grant that was authorized under ESSA. You know, 30%, I think it's like 20% of that funding was meant to be used for safe and healthy schools. And it's specifically around, you know, bullying prevention, mental health awareness, hiring more school counselors, psychologists, social workers to be in your school to work with students so that we can identify, you know, potential problem areas early and provide the supports and services that students need. So I think that is a good talking point if any of these things come up, but certainly we'll work a little bit more on that before you all get here.
All right, the next question. Does the cut to Title II include 21st century grants and after-school programming?
So those are two separate programs, but yes, the president's budget did eliminate Title II, and his budget for FY 2019 also would cut funding for after-school programs, and that 21st Century Community Learning Centers program can also be used for extended day and expanded day activities in middle and high schools as well.
All right, next question is, what about appropriations for health and human resources funding that has impact of the welfare and education readiness of our students? Are there one or two big focusing points that intersect with education?
That's a good question. An area that has been, of course, that's been getting a lot of attention is, of course, opioids.
Yes.
And so we're obviously, you know, that's obviously a huge issue, and you saw it in both the president's budget, and that's kind of just the chatter up on the Hill that this final 2018 omnibus bill that gets done likely in March is going to include a decent chunk for opioid funding. It's not known at this time exactly what that'll be, but that's one area.
Yeah, I think that is. I think if I go back to a point I was making somewhat earlier, tying that into education is the care of the student and the mental health and well-being of the student. I mean, if a student is hungry, if a student has to worry about a parent who is addicted to opioids, or a brother or a sister, their education will suffer because of that. I think we obviously need, I think the kind of the point you can make there is, if we really want students to be effective, they need to be cared for, not just in the classroom, but outside the classroom as well. And there needs to be that support net that's able to do that for everyone. Otherwise, they really are going to struggle in school, and they're not able to pay as much attention or really focus as well based on while they're thinking about those outside things that are having such a negative impact on their life. So I think that's one way you can really kind of tie those in together. And I can't actually see who asked that question, but if somebody has a specific question about that, and you want to come up and kind of chat with us while we're there, if you have a specific issue or two that you're really thinking about, I'm more than happy to sit down with you and we can come up with some good talking points to work out for you. So we're more than happy to talk about that when we're at the conference. That's it. And yeah, for right now, I think that's all the questions we have. Does anybody else have any other questions they want to add right now? And if for whatever reason you forget your question or something like that, once again, we will be there at the conference, all four of us, ready to answer everybody's questions. We're going to be very accessible. We'll be there on site all day, each day, ready to talk to folks. So, but right now is your chance to ask your question if you have anything else you want to answer.
Great. Well, I think that's it. Thank you all for joining us. I know this was a long session. We sometimes split these into 2 different dates and times, and just seemed easier to get it all done in one afternoon. So appreciate you spending your time with us. And again, feel free to contact any of us if you have any additional questions, and we look forward to seeing you in a few weeks.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks.